Okay, and last but not least, we will have Ms. Dovgal. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
I'm not getting any French or English audio on this headset, just FYI, for later questions. Yeah,
Thank you.
Want to mention it. All right. Oops. Okay. Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Congratulations on your appointment as chair of this committee. Since I last appeared before this committee in October, the government has reiterated its commitment to making Canada an energy superpower. It signed a memorandum of understanding with Alberta, partially about securing access to tidewater for our product, and it has said it will not implement the oil and gas emissions cap. The Prime Minister has spoken of trade diversification, energy security, and growth. These are the right instincts, but the policy architecture that actually governs how our industries operate has not caught up. The federal output-based pricing system, OBPS, remains the single most consequential mechanism shaping industrial carbon costs in this country, and it is still built on assumptions, models, and design choices from a policy era whose effective goal was to constrain production, not to enable it. OBPS does not merely set a carbon price, it serves as a federal backstop, and critically, as a reference against which every industrial carbon price by province is assessed. The federal benchmark uses the OBPS to define the minimum stringency that provincial systems must meet, the same coverage thresholds, marginal price signal, and tightening trajectory. Provinces have design flexibility, but the OBPS sets the floor, and the composition of its economy determines the weight of that floor. In Alberta and Saskatchewan, where oil and gas extraction, conventional production, mining, and upgrading comprise the overwhelming share of industrial emissions, meeting those minimum requirements translates into enormous coverage obligations, more than the price of a Timbit. The mechanism by which these costs escalate is not the carbon price itself, it is stringency, the annual ratcheting down of benchmarks that determines how much of a facility's emissions are subject to that price. Most sectors begin at 80% of their historical average intensity, declining by 2% per year. By 2030, that benchmark reaches 64%. The impacts of stringency are significant, but not well understood. Stringency is a far more politically palatable way to burden our most productive industries than by raising the carbon price itself, which, to be clear, is already also happening year by year. That is precisely because almost no one outside industry understands how it works, and that is all compounded by a deeply troubling feature of OBPS, the way energy-intensive, trade-exposed, EITE sectors are treated. Iron, steel, lime, cement, they receive all very high EIT status, so they are subject to a more favorable, slower tightening rate. Oil and gas extraction, which should qualify, does not. And in fact, when you plot the thresholds that Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC, uses to determine very high status, the boundary is nonlinear. It appears to zigzag specifically around oil and gas, conventional oil and gas production, excluding our largest and most trade-exposed sector from this favorable treatment. Meanwhile, the models underlying these decisions are built on assumptions that are fundamentally disconnected from how the industry actually operates and makes investment decisions. ECCC uses equilibrium models that effectively assume that producers will continue investing in decarbonization past the point of profitability. That assumption may satisfy an academic framework, but it is a poor reflection of how capital allocation decisions are actually made. Companies do not invest to break even, they invest where they can earn competitive returns. And if the policy environment makes those returns unachievable, capital moves elsewhere. It doesn't just absorb the cost. This matters most for new facilities, not just existing ones. Most modeling only asks whether a carbon price will shut in current production. The far more consequential question is whether it prevents new production from being built, which, to be clear, we need to do if we want to expand our energy exports to the world, as this Prime Minister has said he wants to. Smaller facilities below 100,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year lack access often to the abatement technologies like carbon capture or electrification that are available to larger emitting facilities. For them, this is not an incentive to reduce emissions, as the policy promises. It is a flat tax levied in a volatile commodity market, punitive in downturns, and still uncompetitive in good years. The policy framework for Canadian oil and gas needs to be competitive in order to attract the amount of capital into Canada needed to grow the economy. Madam Chair, the government says it wants to be an energy superpower. You cannot get there by slightly dialing back the mechanisms designed to keep energy in the ground. The philosophy has to change, and those tools must change with it. OBPS must be reformed so that the EITE risk assessment reflects the actual trade exposure of our energy sector. The large emitter threshold should be set at 100,000 tons, consistent with Alberta's tier system, and before any further tightening is imposed, a comprehensive, transparent review of competitiveness impacts should be conducted with provinces and industry at the table table as partners, not as afterthoughts. This country is extraordinarily resource and energy rich. We have the geology, the workforce, and the regulatory maturity to serve global markets responsibly. What we lack today is a policy framework that recognizes these assets instead of taxing them into irrelevance. That is a gap this committee can address. And thank you so much, Madam Chair. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Ms. Dovgal.
Just like to direct my questions now at Margareta, and with respect to the natural resource sector, one of the things that comes up a lot in respect to this policy is carbon leakage, and I'm just wondering maybe if you could speak to that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. If you talk to oil and gas producers, it's no longer a theoretical. They see these regulations. I've looked at them. We're doing some research that we plan to publish, I think, mid-April, submit to this committee as well. And when they do the math, it's pretty sobering. So to put it in perspective, thermal producers that are using SAGD, steam-assisted gravity drainage, and that accounts for about 75 to 80% of production, in-situ bitumen production in Canada. For those guys, with the current schedule that's been published, I have heard from a number that at a certain point it becomes more economically rational for them to turn off the steam, pull as much oil out as they can as fast as possible while the reservoir is still hot, and then get out of Dodge, deploy that capital to a jurisdiction that doesn't have comparable carbon costs, which for the record is most jurisdictions. Most jurisdictions don't do what Canada's doing, certainly not energy producers. And the ones that I'm speaking of, these aren't marginal producers. These are, as we know, some of the lowest emissions intensity producers globally, and their liabilities are fully funded, so they can just get out whenever they want, and then we lose those jobs, we lose those opportunities, and those emissions, most crucially, do not stop. They just go somewhere else.
Into my next question with respect to investment and the implication on investment in Canada, which means Canadian jobs and growth in the natural resource sector. So ultimately, what does this mean for investment as we're trying to attract it? If you could just expand quickly on that.
Yeah, so most countries are assessing on a facility by facility level first their cumulative carbon cost. So they want to understand whatever framework they're operating in, what their costs are actually going to be, but they're also looking at it on a portfolio basis. So it's not just specific. Let's say there's a company who operates both in BC and Alberta. They have different calculations, different facilities, different sizes. Depends on the technology that they're using. Many companies in those cases are actively now identifying pathways, I've heard, to get out of Canada. So we're not going to be able to produce the oil and natural gas nearly at the scale that we want. We're going to lose the tax revenues, the royalties, the jobs, the direct and indirect jobs, the supply chain opportunities for Indigenous communities. All of these things are in jeopardy if we don't look seriously at what OBPS is scheduled already to accomplish if it's not fixed.
Thank you. And just another question. With respect to the policy, do you think, in your opinion, working in this sector, that the policy is proportionate to the environmental benefits that would be achieved through the government's plan?
Yeah, I think it's disproportionate, predominantly because if your objective is to decarbonize by deindustrializing, sure, the policy is going to be a success, and we're just going to lose that industry and that investment, and those emissions are going to go somewhere else. If your objective is to get the balance with the resources that we have, the assets that we have available to serve Canadians, then this policy is not actually accomplishing that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Dovgal, could you speak a little bit about the carbon border adjustment? I mean, it's been mentioned a few times. How much of our economy is exposed to that in reality? I mean, we are geographically attached to the United States. Forever, it's going to be our largest market.
Yeah. Yeah, I think just high level. I'm not an expert in carbon border adjustments as an area, but what I understand and what experts I've consulted with and have spent time trying to understand their thinking on have told me is there is no, at present, market pricing in of carbon intensity. We're talking about policy tools on a national level for imports and exports, but at present, any emissions reductions that Canada or any energy producer does, the cost of that is not carried on to the consumer of the product. It's a cost that the producer has to bear. And I think that's important as a principle to keep in mind. I think generally border carbon adjustments they're a reality that Canadian exporters are ready for, and any policy mechanism, OBPS, in a good design does need to reflect that reality. We need to be compliant with future EU, UK standards.
I'm getting at how much of our economy is going to be exposed to that versus how much of the economy is going to continue to be exposed to the United States where there is no carbon border adjustment?
I honestly can't speak to that.
Okay, thank
I
you.
can look it into and send you some details.
Appreciate that.